The winter did not arrive with a whisper on the high ridges of the Montana Territory. It came as a violent reclamation, a heavy white blanket that sought to bury the memories of a scorched summer and the sins of those who lived within its reaches. Garrett stood by the window of his small, sturdy cabin, his hand resting on the soft, feathered neck of Copper, his golden retriever, whose ears were pricked toward the howling dark. The wind was a physical weight, pressing against the logs with a low, mournful groan that sounded like a chorus of ghosts seeking entry. Garrett had lived in this isolation for 3 years, a self-imposed exile born of a regret he rarely named, even to himself, finding a strange solace in the way the frost claimed the land. He was a man of quiet competence, his hands calloused by the labor of the frontier, and his heart hardened by the silence he had cultivated in the high altitudes where the air was thin and the judgment of men felt far away. The frost on the glass panes grew in intricate, jagged patterns, obscuring the world outside until it was nothing more than a swirling gray void of ice and shadow. Inside, the hearth flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the floorboards, but the warmth felt fragile against the immense, crushing cold of the wilderness that hammered at the door. He knew the stories of men who had been swallowed by such storms, their bodies found in the spring as nothing more than pale landmarks in the thaw, and he respected the mountain's power to erase a life. Copper, with his coat the color of a tarnished penny, paced the length of the room, his paws clicking softly on the pine boards with an anxious rhythm. The dog was restless, a low whine vibrating in his throat that spoke of something more than just the wind or the rattling of the shutters. Garrett watched the dog, his eyes narrowing as he tried to peer through the white veil, wondering what the animal sensed in the chaos of the blizzard. There was a dignity in this loneliness, a choice he made every day to remain apart from the gossip and the greed of the town and the valley below. But even he felt the sharp, ominous edge of the solitude tonight. The world was shrinking, closing in until there was nothing left but the heat of the fire, the breath of the dog, and the vast, unyielding cold that waited just beyond the timber. He checked the latch, his movements practiced and slow, ensuring the wood was stacked high and the water was within reach. He was prepared for the end of the world, or at least the end of the season, but he was not prepared for the way the mountain was about to shift beneath his feet, bringing a different kind of storm to his very threshold. He felt a strange pull of anticipation, a tightening in his chest that he could not explain, as if the very air inside the cabin was being electrified by the pressure of the storm outside. Copper stopped his pacing and stood frozen at the door, his golden tail low and still, waiting for a sound that had not yet broken through the roar of the gale. The disruption came not as a loud bang, but as a soft, rhythmic thud against the heavy oak of the front door, a sound so delicate it was nearly lost to the screaming gale. Copper let out a sharp, inquisitive bark, his golden fur rippling as he lunged toward the entrance, his tail wagging with a frantic, worried energy that mirrored the sudden pounding of Garrett's own heart. Garrett reached for his heavy wool coat, his brow furrowed in disbelief, for no soul should have been moving in a blizzard of this magnitude, and certainly not on this isolated ridge. When he pulled the door open, the wind surged inside with a predatory howl, bringing a flurry of ice that hissed against the fire and nearly extinguished the light. There, silhouetted against the blinding white, was a figure that seemed more like a specter than a human, a small shape nearly buried in the drifts. It was a woman, her frame small and trembling, wearing a light orange prairie dress that was entirely unsuited for the Montana winter, the fabric a jarring spark of color against the gray world. The dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second layer of ice, and her face was a mask of pale exhaustion, her lips tinged with the blue of a deep frostbite. This was Mei Ling, a widow from the mining camp who had been spoken of in hushed, judgmental tones by the townspeople for her refusal to leave after her husband's passing. She looked at Garrett with eyes that were clouded by the onset of hypothermia, her hands clutching a small satchel as if it held the last of her life, and her dignity. Garrett did not hesitate, the instinct of survival overriding the shock of her presence and the questions that flooded his mind. He reached out, his large hand steadying her as she stumbled over the threshold, her legs giving way the moment she felt the sudden, stinging change in temperature. He slammed the door shut against the storm, the sudden silence of the interior ringing in his ears like a physical blow. "Get into my cabin, it's freezing outside," he said, his voice a low, grounded rumble that cut through her daze. He didn't ask how she had found him, or why she had braved the pass. He simply moved her toward the hearth, his movements efficient and devoid of the prying curiosity that usually met her in the valley. Copper was immediately at her side, his warm, golden body pressing against her damp skirts as if trying to lend her his own heat by sheer force of will. She was a survivor, that much was clear in the way she refused to let go of her satchel even as her body shook with violent tremors. Garrett knelt beside her, the golden retriever sniffing her damp hem with a concerned gentleness, and for the first time in years the cabin felt crowded, the air thick with the scent of wet wool, and the sudden, sharp reality of another human soul's desperation. The first few hours were a dance of cautious alliance, a period where words were few, and the labor of staying alive took precedence over the formalities of introduction. Garrett moved with a restrained warmth, heating a pot of thin broth and laying out dry blankets without demanding a single word of explanation or gratitude. He understood that dignity was often the first thing lost in a struggle for survival, and he was determined to let Mei Ling keep hers, even as he tended to her frozen limbs. She sat wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe, her dark hair drying in the firelight as she sipped the broth, her eyes tracking his every movement with a wary intelligence that spoke of a life spent avoiding traps. She was a woman who had learned to expect nothing for free, and the silence of the cabin seemed to both comfort and unsettle her after the noise of the camp. The golden retriever Copper had made it his personal mission to guard her, his head resting on her feet as she sat by the fire, his soft eyes never leaving her face. "I can pay for the shelter," she said eventually, her voice brittle but clear, the accent of her homeland still coloring the edges of her words like a fine silk thread through a rough weave. Garrett didn't look up from the stove where he was stirring the coals to keep the heat constant through the night. "You'll pay by not catching a fever and dying on my floor," he replied, his tone short but not unkind, his eyes fixed on the embers. "I don't take coin for common sense, and it's common sense to stay inside when the sky is falling." Mei Ling watched him, her posture straightening despite her fatigue, the light orange fabric of her dress beginning to steam as it dried near the flames on the chair where he had placed it. She was a woman who had worked the harsh laundry lines of the camp, her hands scarred by lie and labor, and she recognized the quiet competence in Garrett that mirrored her own history of endurance. There was no pity in his gaze, only a recognition of the pressure they both lived under in a world that didn't want them. Copper let out a soft huff of breath, shifting his weight to get closer to her, and the gesture of acceptance seemed to break the last of her icy reserve. "Your dog has more kindness than the men in the valley," she whispered, her touch light and uncertain as she stroked his golden ears. They sat in a shared heavy stillness, the firelight casting a warm glow over the orange of her dress, which now sat drying like a defiant spark of life against the brown logs of the walls. It was a fragile peace, built on the mutual understanding that for tonight the mountain was their only enemy, and the cabin was the only sanctuary left in a world that had turned its back on them both. As the storm settled into a long, rhythmic siege that lasted for days, their alliance shifted into a routine of shared labor and incremental disclosures that filled the quiet spaces of the cabin. Trust was not something spoken aloud in the frontier. It was something earned through the way a person handled a broom, or the way they looked at you across a candle flame when the oil was running low. Mei Ling refused to sit idle while Garrett worked, her pride manifesting in the way she took over the preparation of their meager meals and the mending of his worn winter gear with a skill he had never possessed. She moved with a grace that the rough environment could not diminish, her light orange dress a constant, vivid reminder of her presence in a space that had been gray and lonely for too long. They spoke in short, practical exchanges, the level of the woodpile, the temperament of the wind, the health of the dog. But beneath the surface, a deeper conversation was taking place. Copper followed her from the hearth to the table, his presence a bridge between two people who had forgotten how to share a room without feeling the weight of the walls. Garrett told her of his time before the mountain, of a family lost to the fever and a life he had walked away from because the memories were too heavy to carry into the sunlight. Mei Ling, in turn, spoke of the husband she had followed across an ocean, only to lose him to a cave-in, and the way the town looked at a Chinese widow as if she were a piece of unclaimed property. She spoke of her refusal to be a victim, her voice hardening when she described the men who thought her grief made her weak. "There is a weight to being alone that people mistake for emptiness," she said one evening as she stitched a tear in his heavy coat, her fingers moving with a precision that Garrett found mesmerizing. He watched her from his seat by the fire, the golden retriever resting between them, his blond fur reflecting the dying embers of the night. "It's not empty," Garrett agreed, his voice reflective and soft, his gaze lingering on the way the firelight caught the dark gold of her eyes. "It's just quiet enough to hear the things you're trying to forget, and sometimes that's the loudest sound there is." They found a strange, grounding comfort in each other's history of endurance, a mutual respect that grew through the simple acts of survival. The cabin, once a place of isolation, began to feel like a fortress they were building together, not against the snow, but against the expectations of the world outside that sought to define them. The intimacy was not born of grand gestures, but of the way he would move the heavy water bucket so she wouldn't have to, or the way she would leave the best portion of the stew for him, both of them pretending the choices were merely practical, while knowing they were becoming essential to one another's peace. The transition from the private sanctuary of the cabin to the harsh realities of social pressure began with the arrival of a visitor when the storm finally broke into a brittle, freezing clarity that revealed the world in sharp relief. A man named Mr. Miller, a person of considerable social power in the valley, who held the deeds to many of the mining claims, rode up to the cabin on a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. He didn't come with a greeting or a word of neighborly concern, but with the air of a man who owned the ground he stood upon, his eyes narrowing when he saw Mei Ling's orange dress drying through the open door. Miller had been the one pushing for Mei Ling's departure from the camp, weaponizing her husband's supposed debts as leverage to seize the small plot of land she still held near the creek. His presence was an omen of the conflict to come, a reminder that the mountain did not keep secrets for long when there was money to be made. "I heard a rumor you were up here, Garrett," Miller said, his voice dripping with a false, oily concern as he remained mounted on his shivering horse. "People are talking in town. They say it's a scandal, a man of your reputation housing a woman of her standing. It's a matter of debt and decency, you understand." Garrett stepped onto the porch, his frame filling the doorway, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt, not as a threat, but as a statement of grounded authority that needed no explanation. Copper stood at his side, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by a low, protective rumble in his chest, his golden hackles slightly raised in warning. "The only thing I understand, Mr. Miller, is that the wind would have killed her if I hadn't opened that door," Garrett replied, his voice dangerously quiet, vibrating with a suppressed rage. "And as for reputation, I've found that the people who talk the loudest about decency usually have the least of it when the sun goes down." Mei Ling stood just behind him, her face a mask of dignified defiance, the orange of her dress bright against the shadows of the cabin's interior. She knew that Miller's leverage was not just about money. It was about the way he could turn the community into a chorus of judgment that could drown out the truth of her life. The external pressure was beginning to tighten, the gossip of the valley reaching up the slopes like a rising tide that threatened to pull them under. Miller looked at the two of them, his eyes glinting with a calculated malice that spoke of future threats. "You can't hide her forever, and you can't pay what she owes," he spat before turning his horse back toward the trail, the snow crunching under the hooves. The silence that followed his departure was heavier than the snow had ever been, the realization settling between Garrett and Mei Ling that their private peace was now a public target, and the choices they made next would define whether they belonged to the mountain or to the mercy of men like Miller. The firelight that evening seemed thinner, a flickering orange ghost that struggled to push back the deepening shadows of the cabin corners as the weight of Miller's threat lingered in the air. After Mr. Miller's departure, a new kind of cold had settled between the logs, one that wasn't born of the wind, but of the sharp, jagged reality of their precarious situation. Garrett sat on his stool, his large hands resting on his knees, watching the way the light played across the hem of Mei Ling's orange dress as she paced the small space. She was standing by the small table, her back to him, but the tension in her shoulders was a language he understood better than any spoken word or formal complaint. For the first time, the silence felt heavy with the things they weren't saying, the fear of the valley, the weight of reputation, and the impossible choice that Miller had laid at their feet with such casual cruelty. Copper, sensing the shift in the air, moved between them, nudging Mei Ling's hand with his wet nose before turning to rest his head on Garrett's boot in a silent plea for peace. "I have no standing in their eyes, Garrett," she said finally, her voice so low it was nearly a whisper, though it held the strength of tempered steel forged in a very hot fire. "To them, I am a shadow that stayed behind when the light went out. If I stay here, they will use me to tear down the walls you've built for yourself over these long years. You have a name in this territory, a quiet name, but a clean one. I will not be the reason they drag it through the mud just to satisfy their own greed." Garrett stood up slowly, the movement causing the golden retriever to lift his head and watch him with soulful, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. He walked across the room until he was standing just behind her, not touching her, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her dried clothing and the scent of the pine needles. He thought of his own years in the dark, the way he had used the mountain as a shield against a world that had hurt him, and he realized that his isolation hadn't been a choice of strength, but a retreat of the wounded. He had lived for 3 years without belonging to anything, thinking that was his freedom, but he had been wrong. "You think I care about the whispers of men who hide behind deeds and debt?" Garrett asked, his voice a grounded, protective rumble that filled the cabin with a sudden, fierce warmth. "I spent a lifetime worrying about what was decent and what was expected, and it left me alone on a mountain with nothing but a dog and a cold bed. You're not a shadow, Mei Ling. You're the only thing in this cabin that feels like the sun is actually rising after a very long night." He reached out then, his hand hesitating before resting gently on her shoulder, a gesture of alliance that was also a total surrender to the heart. "If they want to drag my name through the mud, let 'em. We'll just find a way to walk through it together until we find clean water on the other side." The following morning brought a brittle clarity to the air, the kind of cold that bit into the lungs and turned every breath into a white plume of defiance against the frozen world. Mei Ling opened her satchel, not to offer coin as she had before, but to reveal the true reason Miller was so desperate to see her driven from the territory before the spring thaw. It wasn't just about her husband's supposed debts. It was about a ledger her husband had kept, a meticulous record of the claims Miller had salted and the way he had manipulated the weight of the gold at the camp's assay office for years. Her husband had died before he could bring it to the marshal, and Mei Ling had kept it hidden, knowing it was the only leverage she had, but also the very thing that made her a target for Miller's men. She laid the small, leather-bound book on the table, its pages yellowed by smoke, but the ink still clear and damning in the morning light. "This is why he comes," she explained, her fingers tracing the names of men who had been ruined by Miller's greed and the numbers that proved the theft. "He does not fear my presence. He fears my memory and the truth I carry in this book. He thinks because I am a widow without a kin, I will simply disappear into the snow and take this truth with me to a shallow grave." Garrett looked at the book, then at the woman who had carried this weight alone through a winter of grief and judgment, and he felt a surge of respect that made his chest ache. He saw the tactical path forward, a way to shift the power from Miller's social leverage to the undeniable weight of evidence that could not be ignored by the miners. Copper sat by the table, his golden tail thumping rhythmically against the floor, as if he understood the gravity of the revelation and the danger it brought. "We don't wait for him to come back with a mob or another threat," Garrett said, his mind moving with the strategic precision of a man who had survived the frontier by anticipating the next move of his enemies. "We take this to the mining committee at the camp. We do it publicly, where he can't use the dark or the cold to hide his hands. It's a gamble, Mei Ling. If they don't believe us, there's no coming back to this mountain for either of us." Mei Ling looked at the orange dress she wore, then at the sturdy walls of the cabin that had become her sanctuary against the storm. "I have spent my life being told what I am allowed to have and where I am allowed to go," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a fierce, quiet intensity that was more powerful than any weapon. "I would rather lose everything by standing up than keep it all by kneeling in the shadows he has made for me." They spent the rest of the day in a quiet montage of routine, preparing for the journey down the slope with a grim determination. Garrett sharpened his tools and checked the dog's paws for ice, while Mei Ling packed their few supplies, their movements synchronized by a new, unspoken trust that didn't need words to be absolute. The pressure from the outside was tightening, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from one of survival to one of purpose. A shared vow that they would no longer be victims of the silence or the greed of men like Miller. The journey to the mining camp was a test of endurance, the snow deep and the wind a constant biting companion that sought to turn them back toward the safety of the ridge. Garrett led the way, his large frame breaking a path through the drifts, while Mei Ling followed close behind, her orange dress a splash of vibrant color against the monotonous white of the landscape. Copper acted as their scout, his golden coat standing out like a beacon against the snow, his keen senses alerting them to the hazards of the trail that were hidden beneath the ice. His presence was a silent reminder of the loyalty that had seen them through the storm, and the bond that was now pulling them toward a confrontation they could no longer avoid. When they finally reached the camp, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the heavy silence of a community that was waiting for a scandal to break or a tragedy to unfold. They walked straight to the center of the settlement, toward the general store where the committee gathered, and as they moved, the faces of the miners and their wives appeared in the windows, watching with a mixture of curiosity and judgment that felt like a physical weight. "Mister?" Miller was already there, standing on the porch with a group of men, his face contorting into a mask of feigned outrage when he saw the two of them approaching. "You have a lot of nerve bringing that woman here, Garrett," Miller shouted, his voice designed to carry to the gathering crowd and incite their worst instincts. "This is a place of business and law, not a harbor for those who run from their obligations or for men who forget their place." Garrett didn't stop until he was standing at the foot of the steps, his presence a grounded anchor that seemed to pull the eyes of the crowd away from Miller's posturing. Copper stood firmly at his side, his golden chest broad and his eyes fixed on the man on the porch with a steady, unwavering gaze. "I'm not here to talk about obligations, Miller," Garrett said, his voice carrying a rhythmic authority that silenced the murmurs of the community. "I'm here to talk about the truth, and I think these men would like to hear it as well." He stepped aside, allowing Mei Ling to move forward, the ledger held firmly in her hands like a sacred object. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge in an orange dress. "This book belonged to my husband," she began, her voice clear and earnest, cutting through the cold like a bell in the morning. "It is a record of every ounce of gold that was stolen from this camp by the man who stands before you and calls for decency. It is a record of lies and theft, and I am here to make sure it is the last thing he ever owns in this valley." The community chorus, once gossipy and cautious, began to shift as the names and numbers were read aloud, the evidence too specific to be dismissed as a widow's grief. They saw their own losses reflected in the pages, their own struggles mirrored in the betrayal of a man they had allowed to lead them through the winter The power that Miller had weaponized began to collapse under the weight of their collective realization, the social pressure turning from a threat against Mei Ling into a wall of resistance against the man who had exploited them all for his own gain. The resolution was not found in a grand explosion of violence, but in the quiet, decisive shift of a community that had found its courage through the example of two people who refused to be shamed. Miller was removed from his position of power, the evidence in the ledger too heavy for even his wealth to overcome, and the legal battle that followed saw his claims frozen and his influence shattered by the very people he had tried to intimidate. But for Garrett and Mei Ling, the true victory was found in the walk back up the mountain, away from the eyes of the world and toward the only place that had ever felt like a home to either of them. They stopped at the ridge where the cabin first came into view, the smoke from the chimney rising in a straight, peaceful line against the deep blue of the evening sky. The threat was gone, the leverage broken, and the future lay before them as open and clean as a fresh snowfall that had yet to be walked upon. Copper raced ahead, his golden fur flying as he bounded toward the door, barking a joyful welcome to the home he had helped protect with his quiet loyalty. Garrett turned to Mei Ling, his heart full of a warmth that the winter could no longer touch or diminish. "You don't have to pay for shelter anymore," he said, his voice soft, echoing the repeated motif of their first night together, but with a new, deeper meaning that made the words feel like a vow. "This place, it isn't just a cabin on a hill for a man to hide in. It's a choice, and it's a life, and I'm choosing you, if you'll have me as I am. I want you to stay, not because the storm is coming, but because I don't want to see the sun set without you standing there in that orange dress." Mei Ling looked at him, her eyes bright with the first real tears he had seen her shed. But they weren't tears of sorrow or exhaustion. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the calluses of her labor meeting the strength of his own in a perfect fit. "I chose you the moment you opened that door and didn't ask me to explain my worth to you," she replied, her voice a soft confession that released the last of the tension between them. "I am not a guest, Garrett. I am home, and I am staying." They stood there for a long moment, the golden retriever sitting patiently at their side, as the commitment became explicit and the isolation of their pasts was traded for the partnership of their future. The frontier was still a harsh, unforgiving place, but they had earned their belonging through consistent choices and the quiet, steady fire of a love that had been forged in the coldest of seasons. The world below them was still full of noise and judgment, but here on the ridge there was only the sound of the wind through the pines and the beating of two hearts that had finally found their way through the dark together. The aftermath of the winter was a season of growth and stability, the thaw bringing a sense of promise that was visible in the concrete images of their daily life on the ridge. As the snow retreated, the mountain revealed a landscape that was no longer a place of exile, but a garden they were tending together with a shared hope. Garrett and Mei Ling worked the land with a shared rhythm, the routine of labor no longer a burden, but a celebration of their partnership and the freedom they had won. The cabin was expanded, a new room built for the future they were planning with every log they notched, and the orange dress was eventually replaced by a sturdier wool of the same vibrant hue, a symbol of the life she had claimed for herself. Copper was a constant presence in their new life, his golden coat shimmering in the spring sun as he napped on the porch, or helped Garrett herd the small flock of sheep they had acquired from the valley. The townspeople still whispered when they came for supplies, but the whispers had changed. They spoke now of the couple on the ridge who had held their ground when the world tried to move them, their story becoming a small piece of the local lore about dignity and the power of truth. One evening, as the first flowers of spring began to poke through the softening earth, they sat on the porch and watched the light fade over the territory they now called theirs. The golden retriever was older now, slower in his movements, but still the watchful protector of the home they had built with their own hands. Garrett looked at the path they had walked, the memories of the shame and the cold, now nothing more than markers of how far they had come in such a short time. "We survived the winter," he said, a reflective closing thought that gestured toward the viewer's own understanding of endurance and hope. But the real work was choosing to stay after the storm was over and the sky turned blue again. Dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you keep for yourself, even when the wind tries to take it. Mei Ling leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach where a new life was beginning to stir in the warmth of the spring. The promise of the future was no longer a mystery or a fear. It was as real as the wood of the cabin and the warmth of the hand she held in the fading light. They were no longer the stoic protector and the proud survivor. They were simply two people who had found that belonging was not a matter of location, but a matter of who you were willing to stand beside when the world turned cold and the lights went out. The final shot of the mountain was bathed in the calm, golden light of a setting sun, a wide, peaceful image of a home that had been earned through the quiet courage of choosing to stay when it would have been easier to run. The orange of the horizon matched the dress she had worn on that first desperate night, but now it was a color of dawn and of peace, signaling a beginning that would outlast even the longest Montana winter.